The private dining suite on the 42nd floor was designed to intimidate. Every surface glowed with a discreet, curated opulence. Backlit onyx walls, a table carved from a single block of rosewood, and a city skyline blurred behind tinted glass. The man at the head of the table, Khalid Al-Masri, a Gulf-born billionaire whose investments moved markets, rested a heavy black pen between his fingers. The contract in front of him was valued at $240 million, its pages still warm from the printer. He had already dismissed 3 consultants that afternoon. Now he wanted privacy. The only outsider still in the room was the server refilling water at the far end, a woman so quiet that even her footsteps seemed to apologize for existing. Her name was Lena Hartwell. But to the 14 men in suits, she was simply the waitress. Khalid looked at her as one might look at a shadow. He said something in a clipped Gulf dialect, sharp, condescending, meant to be untranslatable to her. A joke at her expense. The table erupted with polite male laughter. She didn't flinch. She didn't even look up. Instead, while adjusting the silver pitcher, she answered him in flawless, classical Arabic, her voice steady, low, untouched by any dialect. The room fell silent in a way that felt physical. The billionaire's smile froze. His pen stopped moving. His advisors looked at her for the first time, as if she had materialized out of thin air. Lena stepped back, not intimidated, but exhausted, as though this moment had cost her something she couldn't afford. He stared at her walking away, unable to understand how he had missed someone like her. Khalid's advisors attempted to recover the atmosphere with forced chuckles, but the room's balance had shifted. Something invisible had cracked. The billionaire leaned back in his chair, studying the woman now placing a tray of crystal glasses on the sideboard. The overhead lights caught the faint tremor in her hands, barely noticeable, but enough for a man trained to read weakness. He spoke again, this time in a different Gulf dialect, slower, testing her. It was the kind of phrasing reserved for servants, dismissive, layered with an old-world authority that assumed compliance. "Translate that," he murmured, eyes narrowing. Lena did, calmly, precisely, word for word. Her voice carried the exact, semantic weight of his sentence, stripped of its arrogance, exposing it for what it was. One of the external consultants coughed into his sleeve. Another pretended to adjust his cufflinks, pretending not to notice the flush on Khalid's face. But humiliation has a texture. It thickens the air. And everyone felt it. Lena stepped away from the table, steady but inwardly furious at herself. She hadn't meant to reply. Every rule she followed, every survival instinct she had built during the last 2 years warned her to stay silent, invisible, background noise. But something in his laugh, something in the casual degradation, had pierced a part of her she tried daily to keep numb. Her mind drifted, unbidden, to the life she had before. Ivory Tower academia, manuscripts brittle with age, the texture of vellum under her fingertips. The fellowship lost without appeal. The research grant withdrawn. The medical debt she couldn't negotiate. The 11 p.m. shifts, both eyes burning from exhaustion, replaying rejection letters she wished she could unread. She had come to this job promising herself one thing: never speak unless spoken to. And even then, never reveal more than a yes or a no. But now, the richest man in the room was watching her with a mix of irritation and interest. She could feel the attention of every suited body pulling toward her, the way they might watch a sudden fire in the corner of a room. A spectacle. A slip. An anomaly. Khalid tapped the pen against his contract. "So," he said, tone deceptively casual, "the waitress has a tongue trained in the old language." His entourage laughed again, but softer. Their eyes didn't leave her. Lena forced her breathing to slow. She stepped toward the door, intending to retreat to the hallway, to disappear before she made anything worse. She needed distance, space to remind herself that this room, this world, was not hers. But Khalid's voice cut through the quiet. "Stay," he ordered. "We may need clarification." The advisors nodded automatically. The door stayed closed, and Lena realized with a dull, rising dread that she had just lost her only means of escape. Some rooms are built to observe how a person breaks. Lena remained near the wall, her hands clasped behind her apron, as if bracing against an invisible wind. The men returned to their discussion. Valuation tables, exclusivity windows, sovereign guarantees. But their attention kept flicking back to her with a curiosity that felt like pressure against her skin. She had been here before, not in this room, not with this billionaire, but in this position, half present, half ghost, tolerated only as long as she stayed quiet. 2 years earlier, she had lived inside a very different kind of silence. The scent of old manuscripts, the faint scratch of archival pencils, the rustle of parchment sheets that hadn't been touched in centuries. She'd been a doctoral candidate in comparative philology, drilling into syntactic shifts between medieval, legal Arabic and early Andalusian court dialects. A niche so narrow that only 4 people in the world cared about it. She was supposed to become the 5th, but academia had other plans. A mentor who retired unexpectedly. A committee that lost interest. A fellowship that evaporated. A rent increase she couldn't fight. And her mother's medical bills. Always arriving, always larger than expected. The collapse came gradually, like a building losing structural integrity, one groan at a time. She started this job telling herself it was temporary. A few evenings, a few weeks. Just until her mother stabilized, just until she could reapply. She wore the uniform like armor and avoided eye contact as if it were contamination. A server blending in with the wood and marble. But somewhere along the way, invisibility had turned into a habit. In this private suite, that habit felt like a failing. Khalid's advisors resumed flipping through the contract binder, 82 pages, embossed, tabbed, and printed on heavy stock paper. Lena recognized the style instantly. A Western legal template, retrofitted with archaic clauses the billionaire's team probably didn't understand. Most people didn't. She had written her thesis on similar structures, but she wasn't here to analyze anything. She wasn't supposed to notice the outdated seals, the mismatched pagination, the suspicious uniformity of digital signatures on pages that looked hand-initialed. She wasn't supposed to think. She was supposed to pour water. Still, her mind, trained by years of parsing micro-anomalies, couldn't help scanning the documents every time she passed the table. The light caught the ink in ways that bothered her. Something about the spacing, the shade, the pressure marks. She pulled herself back. This wasn't her world anymore. Curiosity, for her, was a luxury she couldn't afford. One of the executives snapped his fingers toward her, asking for coffee without looking at her. She nodded, grateful for the distraction, and crossed the room as quietly as she could. Behind her, the men muttered about deadlines, urgency, a closing window. She had no idea that the very thing she was trying to ignore, the faint itch of something wrong, was the reason she would soon be the only person in that room who could prevent a catastrophe. Sometimes the smallest details refused to stay silent. By the time Lena returned with the coffee tray, polished silver, porcelain cups aligned like soldiers, the atmosphere had thickened into a ritual. The men had shifted positions around the table, forming a semicircle facing the billionaire and the projected dossier rising from the embedded screen. A discreet chime announced the arrival of the expert delegation. 3 men in bespoke suits, each carrying a slim black portfolio. Their shoes made no sound on the carpet, but their confidence filled the room instantly. They were the kind of consultants who specialized not in knowledge, but in certainty. The lead expert, a man with snow-white hair and the posture of a retired diplomat, bowed toward Khalid. "Sir, the asset is ready for final review." Lena set the coffee tray on the sideboard. She turned toward the door again, rehearsing her exit in her mind. Walk softly. Don't draw attention. Don't interrupt. But then one of Khalid's advisors, an American with a polished smile, gestured at her. "You there. Don't leave. We may need additional service as we review the final documents." It wasn't a request. It was permission withheld. Her throat tightened, but she nodded. She stepped back to her quiet corner, the place where servers stood to become furniture. The lead expert tapped the screen, revealing the center of this entire negotiation. A 14th century maritime charter, allegedly drafted in a North African port, detailing exclusive trade rights across a now strategic corridor. The document, if authentic, would secure Khalid a $240 million claim to a disputed logistics zone. Its value lay not in the words themselves, but in the historical leverage it provided. Khalid leaned forward. "Explain it to me again," he said, his voice cool. The expert smiled with rehearsed confidence. "Sir, the charter is perfect. Flawless provenance, tested, certified by 3 independent labs. The language is consistent with documents of its era. The seals match. The vellum is untampered." His tone implied that doubt itself would be an insult. Lena inhaled slowly. Something inside her recoiled, not at the bold claims, but at the phrasing. Perfect. Nothing historical is perfect. The expert flipped through supporting materials, chemical audits, radiocarbon ranges, provenance chains. Each slide glowed with the sheen of certainty, but all Lena could see, in the corner of her eye, was the actual charter resting inside a custom humidity-controlled case at the center of the table. She recognized the script's style, the unusual letter forms, the suspiciously consistent pressure patterns. Her fingertips twitched. She didn't want to look too closely. Not here. Not like this. Not when her life depended on staying unnoticed. But she had spent a decade training her brain to detect anomalies without conscious effort. It was like trying not to hear someone whisper your name. The experts continued their glowing presentation. The billionaire nodded. The pen on the table waited. Lena stayed frozen in the corner, knowing, terrifyingly, that she could already see something they could not. Every instinct she had begged her to stay silent, but truth has its own gravity. The presentation shifted from glowing summaries to technical validation, spectral graphs, microphotography, pressure mapping scans. The kind of visuals meant to overwhelm doubt through sheer quantity. Each slide was designed to tell the same story. Everything is authentic. Khalid's advisors leaned in, nodding like disciples absorbing scripture. Somewhere behind them, the city lights flickered against the glass, but inside the room, nothing moved except data and arrogance. Lena watched from her corner, her posture obedient, her mind anything but. She poured 3 cups of coffee as quietly as possible, placing them on the table one by one. But each time she leaned in, her eyes caught another detail. An ink stroke that was too saturated for the claimed century. A diacritical mark that aligned too perfectly, a correction stroke that lacked the tremble typical of reed pens used on aged vellum. Her discomfort sharpened. The consultant spoke with an air of untouchable authority. The ink composition aligns with late medieval standards. The pagination is original and unaltered. The seals correspond with early Hafsid models. Lena swallowed. No, they didn't. Not entirely. She wasn't sure yet. Intuition is not evidence. But the inconsistencies pulsed at the edges of her vision like faint cracks in glass. She had seen real 14th century vellum hundreds of times. She knew how ink aged when mixed with soot versus iron gall. She knew how humidity carved microscopic waves into the surface. She knew how authenticity breathed. The document on the table wasn't breathing. The snow-haired expert lifted the case as if holding a holy relic. This, gentlemen, is the cornerstone of your future trade corridor. One stroke of the pen, and the rights become yours. Khalid reached for the pen again. Lena's pulse stuttered. Her instincts, a scholar's instincts, not a server's, tightened like a fist. She tried to step back, to shut down the reflex, to analyze, to retreat behind the safety of silence. But then the lead expert said something that made her breathe in sharply. The script shows no signs of correction or hesitation. That was not true. Even from where she stood, Lena had seen at least 3 hesitation points in the opening lines. Tiny pauses where the writer had lifted the pen awkwardly, edges too sharp for genuine medieval fluidity. And the baseline alignment was suspiciously modern. Her throat warmed with the beginning of fear. She knew too much. And knowing too much in a room like this was dangerous. She tried to lower her gaze, but her eyes betrayed her, drifting back to the charter again and again. The shadows of the recessed lights revealed micro-textures most would overlook, except her. Something was very wrong. And yet the men in the room were moments away from locking themselves into a $250 million trap. One they couldn't see, but one she could already feel tightening. Sometimes the truth begins as a faint discomfort that you can't explain, no matter how hard you try. The expert team shifted seamlessly into their final validation sequence, projecting a rotating 3D scan of the charter. The vellum spun slowly, illuminated by a cool artificial light that made every fiber look pristine, almost polished, too polished. Khalid rested his wrist on the table, pen angled toward the signature line. He wasn't reckless, he was meticulous. But wealth at his level often breeds a dangerous confidence, the belief that expertise can be bought, and therefore must be correct. His advisors murmured behind him, "Everything checks out. 3 labs can't all be wrong. This closes the corridor deal permanently." Lena heard every word, though she wished she hadn't. The door behind her remained firmly closed. The American executive who'd ordered her to stay now stood near it like a guard, not intentionally, just territorially. In these rooms, power arranges bodies like furniture. She was trapped. Invisible, but trapped. The discomfort gnawing at her ribs grew sharper. A quiet panic bloomed somewhere deep in her chest, the kind she used to feel during her last academic defense, when she knew a professor's argument was flawed, but didn't yet have the courage to say it aloud. Khalid spoke without looking at her. "You," he said, the one with the impeccable classical tongue. Lena froze. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "What exactly did you study?" he asked, "before you chose to bring me coffee?" The room stilled. The advisors turned, half amused, half curious. The experts paused mid-presentation. Lena forced herself to breathe. "I studied medieval philology," she said quietly. "Comparative legal manuscripts, mostly North African and Levantine archives." One of the consultants raised an eyebrow. "Convenient background," he muttered, almost mocking. Khalid's gaze sharpened. "And this charter, does it meet your academic expectations?" A trap. She heard it in the softness of his tone. If she criticized the charter, she risked appearing presumptuous. If she praised it, she became irrelevant again. Either way, her answer would be used to put her in her place. But the truth pressed against her throat. "I haven't examined it closely, sir," she said. "I'm not part of the review." "That wasn't my question." A slow exhale left her body. She looked down, not at the floor, but at the reflection of the charter case in the polished table surface. The light struck it at a new angle, revealing something she had missed before. An inconsistency in the vellum's grain direction. Medieval vellum was scraped in a particular pattern that produced subtle orientation lines. This one had alignment, too uniform, too modern, too machine-treated. A chill rippled through her. Khalid tapped the pen again. "Well?" he insisted. Every pair of eyes in the room locked onto her, waiting for her to either shrink or speak. Her voice, quiet, steady, traitorous, escaped before she could stop it. "There are elements that don't sit comfortably." A ripple of irritation moved through the men. The lead expert laughed lightly, indulgently. "A waitress," he said, "is uneasy with a document vetted by international labs." Khalid didn't laugh. He watched her more closely now, suspicion blooming behind his calm expression. And Lena realized that the next mistake, hers or theirs, would change everything. The moment before disaster often masquerades as routine. Pressure reshaped the room. Not loud, not dramatic, just subtle, suffocating, like the air had thickened into something you had to wade through. The lead expert, sensing the billionaire's attention shifting toward her, doubled down on his performance. He flipped open his portfolio with a crisp snap. "Sir," he said, "our team has authenticated no fewer than 70 medieval charters. This one is among the cleanest we've ever vetted." His assistant leaned in, tapping a laminated page. You can see the natural ink feathering along the edges. Impossible to replicate artificially. Lena's stomach tightened. It was absolutely possible to replicate, if you knew how. Modern glycerin treatments, micro-etching, synthetic humidity cycles. She'd written papers on it. Papers no one in this room had read. The American advisor stepped slightly closer to the billionaire. "We're losing time. The corridor rights won't stay unclaimed. Sir, I suggest we finalize." Khalid didn't speak. He just raised the pen again. The gesture sent a faint electric jolt through Lena. Something primal inside her recoiled. She tried to focus on her breathing, but her mind kept replaying every anomaly she'd glimpsed that evening, each one small, subtle, but now forming a pattern she could no longer ignore. The vellum thickness, the uniformity of the ink, the artificially even pigmentation, the oddly clean margins, the direction of the grain that didn't match 14th century scraping techniques. It wasn't a conclusion yet, but it was heading there, fast. She stepped back, but her heel hit the wall. There was nowhere left to retreat. The lead expert lifted the charter case slightly, tilting it so Khalid could see the signature line. "Sir, with your authorization, this becomes your leverage for the next 50 years. Advisors murmured their agreement. Lena's pulse hammered. Her hands tingled. Her chest burned with an old, familiar grief, the grief of watching something you love be misunderstood by people who never cared about it in the first place. Khalid finally spoke. "Wait." A dozen breaths caught in the room. He turned his head, slow and deliberate, and looked directly at Lena. "You said there were elements that don't sit comfortably." His voice held no anger now, only curiosity sharpened into a blade. "Which elements?" The American advisor frowned. "Sir, she's not qualified." "Silence." The word hit the table like a hammer. Everyone obeyed. Khalid's eyes stayed on her. Lena's throat tightened. She felt the weight of every academic failure, every job rejection, every night she had cleaned glasses while thinking about manuscripts she would never touch again. She could lie, say she misspoke, say she was tired, say nothing looked wrong after all. Let the billionaire sign, walk away, survive. But the truth was pressing up against her chest like a trapped breath. She lifted her eyes slowly toward the charter case. "I can't say without examining it more closely," she whispered, "but something feels inconsistent." The room bristled with irritation, dismissal, impatience. The lead expert smirked. "Feelings aren't evidence. Lena forced herself to meet his gaze. "No," she said softly. But inconsistencies usually point to where the evidence is hiding. Truth often begins as a whisper that refuses to die. Silence pooled in the corners of the suite, thick enough to feel. Khalid lowered the pen, just slightly, just enough to signal that the moment had shifted. The experts glanced at one another with tight, irritated smiles, professionals unaccustomed to being questioned, especially not by someone wearing an apron. "Very well," Khalid said, gesturing to the charter. "Look more closely." Lena shook her head immediately. "Sir, I wasn't trying to intrude. I only meant—" "You meant," he cut in, "that something feels wrong. So show me why." The lead expert cleared his throat sharply. "With respect, sir, this is unnecessary. The labs have already—" "I asked her." The authority in his voice crystallized into something final. Even the expert stepped back. Lena's feet felt rooted to the carpet. She didn't want to approach the table. She didn't want to be visible, central, or responsible. But the billionaire was watching her with an expression that left no room for retreat. He gestured again. "Come." She exhaled once, softly. Then she approached the charter. The humidity-controlled case was open, propped at a perfect angle on its velvet mount. The surface of the vellum glowed faintly under the warm, recessed lights. From a distance it looked convincing, aged, textured, dignified. But up close, her breath faltered. There it was, the first anomaly. Clear, sharp, unmistakable. She leaned closer, careful not to touch. The advisors shuffled behind her. The consultants folded their arms, prepared to dismiss anything she said. "What do you see?" Khalid asked. Lena swallowed. Her voice came out steady despite her pulse hammering. "The ink does feather," she began. "But the spread is wrong. Real medieval ink feathers outward in uneven microlines because it's drawn into the fibers. This ink feathers downward." The lead expert laughed. "That is absurd. Ink doesn't feather downward." "It does," she said quietly, "when the surface has been enzyme treated, when someone artificially ages the vellum to mimic absorption." A ripple of tension moved through the room. She continued, each word slow, clear, forensic. "The surface here shows a vertical absorption pattern. That only happens when the vellum's top layer has been softened with a modern humidity cycle. A medieval sheet wouldn't react this way." One advisor leaned in, squinting. "But the radiocarbon tests—" "Radiocarbon only dates the material," Lena said. "Not when the writing was placed on it." Even Khalid's stillness shifted. She pointed, without touching, to a faint irregularity near the edge of the script. "And here, there's a pigment clot. Ink from the medieval period didn't clump like that unless the scribe paused too long. But this clot has a glossy edge. That happens with synthetic gall substitutes used in modern restorations." The expert's composure tightened into panic disguised as annoyance. The lead expert stepped forward. "Sir, she is making theoretical observations. None of this constitutes proof." Lena turned to him, just slightly. "It's not proof yet. It's the first crack." Khalid sat back slowly, eyes never leaving her. The air changed again, not hostile, but charged. As if the billionaire had just realized that the least powerful person in the room was the only one capable of saving him. Some truths announce themselves the moment someone is finally forced to look. Khalid pushed the charter fraction of an inch away from him, as though distance might clarify something the experts had failed to see. The men around the table exchanged glances, some irritated, some uneasy, but none dared to challenge him directly. Except the lead expert, whose polished confidence had begun to crack. "Sir," he said tightly, "what she's suggesting doesn't align with the authenticated results. Vertical absorption patterns can be influenced by storage conditions, not fraud." Khalid's voice dropped into a dangerous calm. Is that your certainty speaking, or your investment? The expert stiffened. My only investment is in accuracy. Good. Khalid turned back to Lena. Continue. She didn't want to. Her heart was beating too fast, her palms damp, her throat tight with the memory of every time she had spoken out and paid for it. But she had seen enough anomalies now to know this wasn't a coincidence. She stepped closer, narrowing her focus. The vellum wasn't wrong. It was lying. There's another issue, she said softly. Which is? Khalid asked. She hesitated, then pointed to the lower margin. The ruling lines. The room stilled. Medieval scribes used faint guidelines, scored with a stylus or blunt needle, to keep the text straight. On real vellum, those scored lines left tiny variations in the parchment thickness. But here, these aren't scored, she said. They're printed, laser thin, too perfect, too uniform. The lead expert scoffed. Impossible. This isn't a replica. Lena shook her head. Not a replica. A hybrid forgery. Real vellum, modern surface treatment, artificially applied ruling, and a script imitating medieval forms. A forger who understands just enough to deceive people who want to believe. The billionaire inhaled slowly, silent, controlled. A dangerous silence. The American advisor cut in sharply. Sir, we're drifting off course. These details won't change the corridor valuation. We have 20 minutes before the other bid. Lena turned, eyes wide. There's another bidder? Of course, he snapped. A sovereign fund from... Khalid raised a hand. The advisor swallowed his words. Lena's pulse stumbled. If there was another bidder, then the urgency wasn't just a tactic. It was leverage, pressure, a trap disguised as opportunity. Khalid lifted the pen again. The act felt unreal, slow motion, like the world folding inward. He poised the tip over the signature line. Sir, Lena breathed. He didn't look at her. Sir, don't sign. Her voice cracked across the room, louder than she intended, sharp, immediate, undeniable. Every head turned. Even she was startled by the sound of it. Khalid's hand stopped mid-air. Absolute stillness. Like the room had exhaled and then forgotten how to breathe again. He turned slowly, deliberately, and met her gaze. Why? He asked quietly. Should I not sign? Lena's chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. She wasn't a consultant. She wasn't protected. She had no authority here. But she had truth. And for the first time in 2 years, she let it speak without apology. Because whoever created this document, she said, built it to trap you. The experts bristled, advisors muttered, papers rustled with agitation. Khalid remained perfectly still. She doubled down, voice trembling but firm. And the trap is inside the language, not the ink. Truth rarely waits for permission to change the room. The billionaire leaned back, fingers steepled, eyes narrow with a hunter's stillness. Explain, he said. Not a request, a command. Lena inhaled, slow, controlled, because the next words could either save her or destroy her. She gestured toward the charter, her fingers trembling despite her composure. The ink and vellum anomalies matter, she said, but they're not the core. The real fraud lives in the syntax, the legal phrasing. The lead expert scoffed loudly. We've had linguists review the wording. No, Lena replied quietly. You've had translators. There's a difference. The billionaire's eyebrow twitched. Interest, cold and surgical. She continued, tapping nothing, touching nothing, only pointing. This charter claims to be a 14th century maritime instrument from a North African port. But the legal clauses follow a structure that didn't exist until the late 15th century. Specifically, the clause outlining retained dominion in perpetuity. Medieval charters didn't use that construction. Semantics, the expert muttered. Semantics are the spine of legal history, she said. Words evolve, syntax evolves, the order of obligations evolves. And this document uses a layered structure: primary grant, conditional annex, then retrospective indemnity that didn't appear until the early Ottoman paper courts. The room froze. One advisor frowned. Meaning? Lena met his eyes. Meaning the writer knew medieval vocabulary, but not medieval logic. She leaned closer to the projected scan. And that's not the only issue. Look at the numerals. The charter uses a form of reckoning notation typical of late Mamluk scribes, but their order of enumeration is wrong. This pattern, she traced the air, is from a 20th century philology textbook. The lead expert's face reddened. You're making accusations without proof. I'm describing fingerprints, she said. The fingerprints of someone who learned this script from modern scholarship, not from authentic manuscripts. Khalid's expression darkened. Lena forced herself to continue. And here, this is the critical part. The closing clause claims that the rights revert to the issuing authority after a period of non-use. The American advisor shrugged. Standard conditional clause. Not in medieval maritime law, she said. And not with this consequence. If you sign this document, and the corridor is contested by the other sovereign fund, which it will be, you automatically forfeit your rights. Not them. The room snapped awake. Khalid straightened in his chair. What do you mean automatically? Lena pointed to the line again. This clause reverses the burden of proof. It means you lose even if you win. It's designed to hand the corridor to the competing bidder, cleanly, legally, irreversibly. A stunned silence swallowed the suite. The billionaire's advisors looked suddenly pale. The lead expert opened his mouth to object, but Khalid cut him off with a single gesture, sharp, final. Lena's voice softened. This is not a medieval charter, sir. It's a legal weapon disguised as one. And for the first time, the billionaire looked afraid. The truth, once unburied, has a way of changing everyone in its path. The billionaire's pen lay abandoned on the table now, glinting under the recessed lights like a discarded scalpel. Khalid leaned forward, elbows on the rosewood surface, his gaze fixed on the charter with a controlled fury that made the air feel electrically charged. "Show me," he said. Lena swallowed. Her throat was dry, but the words came anyway. Measured, clear, precise. She stepped to the side of the table so everyone could see the projected text. "This," she said, pointing to the final third of the document, "is where the true manipulation begins." The room tightened. The experts shifted uncomfortably. Someone's cufflink clicked against a glass. "Read this segment," she continued. "The clause stating that the Charter's rights are reaffirmed upon challenge." The American advisor nodded. "Yes, that's the protective clause. It reinforces Khalid's claim if a sovereign fund disputes the corridor." "No," Lena said softly. "It doesn't." She tapped the magnified script. In medieval legal instruments, reaffirmation clauses worked in one direction. They protected the issuer. But here, it's inverted. The language appears defensive, but its internal logic is inverted. The advisors frowned. "Inverted how?" one asked. Lena straightened. "It states that the rights must be reaffirmed by the issuer, not the holder. But the issuer no longer exists. Therefore, automatic lapse is triggered, handing the corridor to the competing party." The billionaire's eyes widened just slightly. "And the competing party is the sovereign fund?" "Yes, sir." "And this happens when?" Her voice was almost a whisper. "Immediately, the moment a dispute is filed. You'd lose the corridor within hours." Shock rippled across the table. The lead expert snapped, desperate. "That interpretation is absurd. No medieval scribe would—" No medieval scribe did, Lena said, turning to him. Because this clause is modern, and the structure isn't even from a medieval source. It mirrors a 20th century legal booby trap, used in post-colonial land transfers. She pointed at the final signature block. And this is the most damning part. The authenticity seal is placed in the wrong position. Medieval charters place seals under the ratifying line. This one places it beside the conditional clause. That's deliberate. The room fell dead silent. Lena let the final blow land. This document wasn't only forged, it was engineered. Someone wanted you to sign away your claim under the illusion of acquiring power. Khalid sat back, face unreadable, hands clasped tightly. Who benefits? He asked. Lena hesitated. Then, the sovereign fund, and whoever supplied them this forgery. A quiet, collective exhale swept through the room, the sound of realization dawning too late for comfort. Khalid rose to his feet. Every man in the room followed instinctively, like gravity had shifted. The billionaire's voice, when it came, was soft and lethal. I was about to hand them everything. One of the executives finally found his voice. How did none of us see this? And she did. Khalid didn't answer. He only looked at Lena, truly looked at her, for the first time. Some traps are built not to be seen, but to be signed. The room fractured into motion. Advisors whispered harshly among themselves. The American executive snatched up his tablet, scrolling frantically through old correspondence. The lead expert barked orders to his assistants to reopen the authenticity packet, his voice cracking as if the confidence he'd worn like armor had finally split down the middle. Khalid didn't move. He stood at the head of the table, arms folded, face carved into composure so sharp it bordered on eerie. His stillness made everyone else look frantic. Lena stepped back, instinctively returning to invisibility, but now invisibility was impossible. Every pair of eyes flicked toward her with suspicion, awe, confusion, and the first faint traces of fear. She didn't want any of it. The American advisor approached Khalid with a shaky voice. Sir, if this is true, the sovereign fund is waiting for confirmation tonight. If we had signed... We didn't, Khalid said coldly. But sir, the withdrawal clause... We didn't sign. His tone silenced the room. One of the younger consultants paced back and forth, muttering numbers under his breath. If the clause is inverted, if the rights would revert instantly, the fund could have filed a dispute minutes after the transaction. They'd own the corridor by morning. And we'd be left, another added, with nothing but legal liability for claiming false rights based on a forged document. The final word, forged, hung in the air like smoke. The lead expert slammed his portfolio shut. This is nonsense. Our labs, verified that vellum. Lena's voice was soft but unwavering. They verified the age of the base material, not the writing, not the logic, not the legal DNA. He spun on her. You're a waitress. What gives you the authority to... Khalid's voice cleaved the air. Enough. The expert froze. Then the billionaire turned to Lena. What else do you see? She swallowed. There's a scribal mark in the lower margin, an imitation of a medieval rubric, but the curvature is wrong. It matches a modern calligrapher's style, the same hand that wrote the main text. Khalid stared at her, expression unreadable. So everything they told me today was constructed, she said. You weren't just being misled. You were being maneuvered. The American advisor's voice trembled. This could be criminal fraud. International, coordinated. Lena felt a wave of dizziness, a moment of almost detachment. This wasn't her world. This wasn't her fight. This wasn't her problem. Except it was, because she'd stepped forward, because she'd spoken, because she'd refused to let him sign. The walls of the suite seemed to close in, thick with tension and expensive panic. Khalid exhaled slowly. "Find out who provided the charter," he told his executives. "Trace every link, every intermediary." The advisors immediately set to work, tablets lighting up with frenzy. Lena stepped back again, overwhelmed by the attention, the noise, the consequences spiraling far beyond her control. Truth, once spoken, has a way of expanding until no one in the room can escape it. The suite shifted from opulent quiet to surgical frenzy. Advisors darted across documents, pulling up encrypted emails and provenance chains. Notifications blinked on screens like warning lights in a cockpit. But Khalid, still, centered, predatory, watched it all with an eerie calm. "Report!" he commanded. The American advisor swallowed hard. "We found the provenance file, sir. The one submitted with the charter. It names a boutique antiquities dealer in Geneva, but—" He hesitated. "There's no actual dealer. The company dissolved 5 years ago." The lead expert blanched. "Impossible. We spoke with their representative." "You spoke with a burner identity," the advisor said, voice cracking. "The address was fake. The chamber registration never existed." A sickly silence followed. Khalid's gaze cut toward the expert. "Did you earn a commission?" The man stiffened. "Sir, that accusation—" It wasn't a question. The expert's face tightened, the truth reflected in the way his jaw locked. "Yes," he finally admitted. "A standard finder's fee? How much?" 2% of the contract value." A few advisors swore under their breath. 2% of 240 million. Lena flinched. Money like this bent good people. Money like this turned experts into liabilities. Khalid didn't raise his voice, but the quiet was sharper than any shout. "You vouched for a forged document because you were paid to close the deal." "It wasn't forged when I reviewed." "It was," Lena interrupted softly. "You just didn't know where to look." The expert glared at her with a mixture of humiliation and hatred. "You think a waitress understands more than accredited labs?" She didn't look away. "I think someone did. And they counted on you not noticing." The advisor closest to the digital dossier spoke up next, sweat gathering at his temples. "Sir, the sovereign fund's representative, the one who kept pushing for a rapid close. He has direct ties to one of the intermediaries. Offshore accounts, shared counsel. This wasn't accidental." The realization slid through the room like cold steel. Khalid lowered himself back into his chair, a king descending to judgment. "So," he said quietly, "they wanted the charter to reach me. They wanted me to sign. And they wanted me to lose." Lena's voice was steady, almost gentle. "Because if you lost, they wouldn't just gain the corridor. They would gain precedent, leverage, international recognition, a legal foothold no negotiation could undo." One of the junior advisors whispered, horrified. "It's not just a trap. It's a handover mechanism." Khalid nodded once, slow, terrifying, resolved. "Remove every external party from tonight's chain. Cancel the closing. Lock every channel." The room erupted into movement again. Lena stepped back, her breathing shallow. She had pulled the thread, and the entire scheme had unraveled. Not because she had power, but because she had seen what others refused to see. Fraud doesn't collapse when confronted with force. It collapses when confronted with clarity. The luxury suite, once curated for immaculate confidence, had transformed into an arena of accountability. Tension hung so thick it rivaled the velvet curtains. Advisors whispered sharply into headsets. Files were locked. Calls were blocked. A transaction worth $250 million had been halted mid-heartbeat. And the eye of the storm, Lena, stood with her back to the wall, trying not to shake. Khalid finally shifted his attention from the chaos to the lead expert, who now looked smaller than he had at any moment that evening. His immaculate suit suddenly seemed too large, his confidence a wrinkled illusion. "You led this verification," Khalid said quietly. The expert swallowed. "With internationally validated protocols." "Protocols," Khalid repeated, as though tasting the uselessness of the word. "You vouched for provenance from a company that doesn't exist. It appeared legitimate at the time." "You are a specialist," Khalid cut in. "Your job is to see what others do not." The irony slipped through the air like a blade. Everyone looked, just briefly, at Lena. The expert's face reddened. His voice turned defensive. "How could I anticipate a sovereign fund using historical forgery as a strategic weapon?" Lena spoke before she could stop herself. "By reading the document, carefully." A hush fell. The expert snapped toward her. "You think this is simple?" "No," she said. "I think it's obvious." The syntax disagreed with its century. The juridical structure contradicted its geography. The ruling lines were printed. The ink absorption was artificial. The signature block was wrong. The seal placement was modern. Every point she listed tightened the noose. "And you missed all of it." The expert's mouth opened, then closed again. He had no rebuttal. Khalid's voice lowered into something colder, heavier. "Return your commission." The man stiffened. "Sir, tonight." "And if I don't?" Khalid's eyes sharpened into something that made the temperature in the room drop. "Then you will owe me far more than money." The expert's throat moved visibly as he swallowed. "Very well," he whispered. "Tonight?" One of the younger advisors approached Khalid with trembling hands. "Sir, we've traced the sovereign fund's contact chain. They routed every exchange through proxies. Someone planned this for months." Khalid leaned back, absorbing the scale of it. Then he asked the question that finally sent a shiver through every person present. "How close was I?" The advisor hesitated. "2 signatures, sir. Yours and theirs. Once you signed, the dispute filing would activate the transfer. Automatic, uncontestable." The billionaire closed his eyes briefly, not in fear, but in the quiet, devastating realization of how much he nearly lost. And then, slowly, he looked at Lena again, not like a server, not like a disruption, but like the only person in the room who had actually seen him drowning. People assume power protects them. But sometimes power blinds more than it shields. The room emptied of noise for a beat, just one fragile beat, before shifting into a new configuration. The advisors moved toward the windows, speaking in low, urgent tones. The experts lingered near the door, pretending usefulness while calculating their escape from humiliation. Only Khalid remained centered, calm and devastatingly focused. On her. "Come forward," he said. Lena hesitated. Her instinct was to shrink, to fade back into the wallpaper the way she had mastered during 2 years of service work. But that instinct had already failed tonight. She stepped toward the table. Her footsteps felt too loud. Khalid studied her not with arrogance, but with scrutiny, like a man trying to understand the device that had just saved his life. "You weren't supposed to be in this room," he said. "I know." "You weren't supposed to speak." "I know." "You weren't supposed to see what my experts missed." Her voice was almost a whisper. "I know." He circled the table and stood beside the charter as though reevaluating the world itself. "You recognized the fraud because of your training," he said. "Yes." "You've worked with medieval documents before." "I used to," she murmured. Before life changed." He nodded slowly, eyes narrowing as the pieces aligned. "You lost your position," she stiffened. "My fellowship ended. My advisor retired. My funding collapsed. I couldn't stay." The billionaire absorbed the words with a surprising softness. "And now you are serving coffee?" Her gaze fell to the floor. "I needed work." For a moment, the room's tension folded into something quieter, almost human. Khalid picked up the charter, this time with new understanding, and studied its surface under the light. "You saw everything," he said. "Everything my team overlooked." "Not everything," she replied. "Just enough to stop a disaster." His expression flickered with the faintest shadow of a smile. "Enough," he repeated. "Sometimes that's all it takes." The American advisor rushed in, flustered. "Sir, the sovereign fund continues to email. They're requesting immediate confirmation." Khalid didn't turn. "Decline. Indefinitely." "Yes, sir." He dismissed the advisor with a gesture, then looked back at Lena. "Tell me something," he said quietly. "When you stopped me from signing, were you afraid?" Her breath trembled. "I've been afraid for a long time, sir." "But you still stepped forward." She felt something inside her loosen, just slightly. "I couldn't watch you be trapped," she said. "Not when I knew what I was seeing." For a moment, neither spoke. Then he asked the question that landed deeper than anything else that night. "How long have you been invisible in rooms like this?" Lena looked up, really looked up, for the first time. "Too long." Khalid nodded, as though confirming something he had sensed but never articulated. Sometimes it takes one moment of courage to make the world look at you differently. The advisors drifted back into the suite, their conversations now quieter, shaken by the realization of how narrowly they'd escaped catastrophe. But Khalid remained still, anchored to the table, his focus never leaving Lena, as if she had shifted from background noise to the central axis of the room. He spoke softly, but the words carried weight. "You saved me from a trap designed by people who assumed I would never question the gift placed before me." Lena exhaled, barely audible. "I only saw what didn't fit." "And how many people," he asked, "could recognize a 15th century legal construct hidden inside a forged 14th century manuscript?" She gave a faint, rueful smile. "Very few, which is why forgers get bolder." Khalid didn't smile back. His expression shifted, serious, contemplative, unsettling in its intensity. "Lena," he said, speaking her name for the first time. "What are you doing here? Truly?" Her throat tightened. She didn't want to unravel her failures in front of him. She didn't want anyone to see her debts, her mother's medical bills, the years of work that dissolved overnight, the academic doors that shut so fast she never had time to understand what she'd done wrong. "I needed income," she said quietly. That was the simplest version of the truth. "But your mind," he said, "belongs somewhere else." The American advisor re-entered with a tablet. "Sir, regarding the next steps, I believe we should—" Khalid lifted a hand without looking at him. Silence. He stepped closer to Lena, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "I want you to lead a forensic review tonight," he said. "Not for the charter alone, but for the entire provenance chain. Every document, every contract, every verification link." Her breath caught. "Sir, I'm not on your staff." "You are now," he replied. "If you agree." Her heart pounded. "I don't have credentials in your world." "You have something more valuable," he said. "You see what others ignore." Lena felt the room tilt in a direction she wasn't prepared for. "I'm not sure I can do what you're asking." "You already did," he said. "Better than anyone I pay millions to advise me." She tried to speak, but the words tangled. "And," he added, quieter still, "I am prepared to retain you on my private forensic team. Long-term, full compensation, full authority." Long-term, full authority. Her life could change in a single sentence, but fear Old, bone-deep fear rose inside her. "Sir, I don't know if I'm capable of stepping back into that world." He held her gaze, unflinching, "Then step into a new one." She glanced at the men in the room, men who had dismissed her, ignored her, underestimated her. Now every one of them watched her with a mixture of respect and caution. She had never occupied a room like this before. But for the first time, she wasn't shrinking. Sometimes the world offers a doorway at the exact moment you feel least ready to walk through it. The suite, once hostile terrain, now buzzed with a different energy, structured, purposeful, almost reverent. Advisors formed a semicircle around the table, screens lit up with provenance chains, forensic scans, and encrypted correspondence. The forged charter sat at the center like a wounded animal, finally recognized for what it was. And Lena, still wearing an apron, still with her hair hastily pinned from her shift, stood among them, not as a server, but as the one person the room now depended on. Khalid gestured toward an empty chair at the table. "Sit." She hesitated. Servers didn't sit. Servers didn't take seats meant for executives and billionaires. But the way he looked at her, steady, assured, left no room for her old invisibility to return. She sat. Her hands trembled for only a moment. Then her training took over. She reviewed the provenance trail first. Every authenticated link contained inconsistencies, mismatched timestamp formats, improbable transfer histories, signatures digitally flattened to look handwritten. She pointed to each anomaly with quiet precision. That seal was lifted from a digital archive. It's pixel perfect. That date notation didn't exist until the 19th century. This signature repeats the same pressure pattern. It's a digital stamp. The advisors leaned in, listening like students around a master. The lead expert, now silent and hollow-eyed, watched helplessly as everything he claimed to understand unraveled with every word she spoke. Next, she dissected the legal structure of the Charter's clauses. "There," she said, "look at the conditional annex. The language mirrors a 20th century arbitration tactic used in oil concessions, not medieval maritime law." The American advisor blinked. "So the whole structure is modern. Modern but disguised. Someone understood just enough history to fake confidence, but not enough to fake authenticity." The deeper she went, the more the room shifted around her, not with condescension or irritation, but with growing respect, even awe. When she finished, Khalid spoke without raising his voice. "Gentlemen," he said, "we are shutting down every connection to the sovereign fund until further notice, and tomorrow we begin legal proceedings." One of the men nodded. "Understood." But Khalid wasn't done. He turned to Lena. "You prevented the loss of a $250 million asset." His next words quieted even the sound of the ventilation system. "And you did it while serving coffee." Her throat tightened. "I didn't expect to be seen tonight," she said. "You were invisible only to people who lacked the eyes to see," he replied. For a moment, the room felt weightless, like the world had tilted toward a version of her she had once believed in, before life stripped it away. Khalid extended a simple, unadorned sentence that would follow her for years. "You belong at this table." Truth has a way of rewriting destinies the moment someone finally listens. The archives of the Al-Masri Forensic Institute smelled of leather bindings, cold stone, and quiet triumph. A year had passed, but sometimes Lena still paused at the threshold of her office. Large windows, calibrated humidity, manuscripts resting in climate-controlled drawers, half expecting it to vanish if she blinked. It never did. Khalid had kept his word. She now led a small, specialized division dedicated to identifying historical forgeries used in high-value negotiations. No apron, no late-night shifts, no shrinking into corners. Her work shaped decisions worth hundreds of millions. Yet her favorite part remained the same: the quiet thrill of examining a manuscript, finding the heartbeat of authenticity, or the fracture that betrayed a lie. Some nights she stayed late, not because she had to, but because she finally wanted to. Her mother's medical bills were a memory. Her debt was gone. Her name, once whispered only by professors who'd forgotten her, now appeared on expert panels and confidential briefs. And every time she walked into a negotiation room, people stood. Not out of deference, out of recognition. She was no longer invisible. She had become the one person powerful men turned to when the truth mattered more than the illusion. If you want more stories like this, stories of brilliance rising from the shadows, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for the next episode.